Hello dear students, welcome to the lecture series of Advanced Java. My topic for today is Hibernate, and we are going to study in depth about what is Hibernate, why it is used, what are ORMs, what is Hibernate mapping types, what is an architecture for using Hibernate or how it works, and we are going to see how you can access a database using Hibernate. So let's begin this exciting journey. Hibernate, as you all have heard and you are excited to develop projects in Hibernate, you should first know what is Hibernate and why you actually need Hibernate. Okay, the basic purpose of using Hibernate is you want to do some kind of database access. Previously you had done this database access using JDBC. So why not JDBC and why we are moving towards Hibernate? So let us start. First of all, you are living in a world of softwares. So all your softwares are connected with your data. Okay, so this can be software stores your data in form of C language. You have your data in C language, you can have in C++, you have in Java, and whatever data you have, they are stored in databases. So you can say that you are storing them in either MySQL, in Postgre, in Oracle, etc. So all your data resides in the database, and all the coding that you are doing is always done in softwares. So there should be some form of connectivity between your software and your database. This thing you had previously done when you were doing something called as JDBC. So JDBC was an API where you were taking all the things from your program or code which were stored in variables and objects, and you were storing them into tabular structures or in your tabular columns or your fields. So this API was basically helping you to connect all your code of your software, that is all your Java code, and take that Java code, store it into the table. Now this had a particular disadvantage. What if you don't know queries? If you are not familiar with queries, you won't be able to use this JDBC API. Also, what if you want to apply all the object oriented concepts, like you have your encapsulation, polymorphism, inheritance. Okay, if you want to apply all these features onto your table, then your JDBC API will not be useful. So in that case, you are supposed to use Hibernate. So Hibernate is a simple framework in Java. What is a framework? Framework is nothing but you already have pre-built codes inside. You are just supposed to use that pre-built code and library so that you can do whatever you want. So Hibernate is a framework in Java which helps you to access your database, and this access, it helps you by doing something called as ORM. So what is ORM? ORM is object relational mapping. Now object means whatever you are doing in your Java file is called as your object. You can consider it as an object. Relation is your table. So this ORM mapping file or this ORM is going to help you to map your class file in Java with the table in your database. So this mapping is called ORM. Before we move on to the various ORM details, let us first see what were the disadvantages of using the simple JDBC approach. When you were using the JDBC approach, it would become very complex if you are using a very large project, okay, because you have multiple number of queries, you need to execute many number of things, and you had to write repeated codes, okay, so it would become a complex task. Okay, it had a large programming overhead. As you know, for each and everything you had to first write the database connectivity code, without which you couldn't move further. So your programming overhead was very large. You couldn't apply the various object oriented concepts on the table. Okay, so there was no encapsulation, no polymorphism, and all the OOP features. Also, you were not able to use the MVC feature, that is model view controller feature, which makes error isolation very easy, fault identification very easy, and your error rectification could be very simpler if you use the MVC framework. and whatever queries that you were writing were database specific. So if you didn't have the knowledge of queries, you couldn't use JDBC. So we moved on to Hibernate. So let us see the advantages of using Hibernate. So Hibernate keeps your business code and things separately, and it helps you map the objects to the database tables. So as I told you, the ORM feature which maps your Java class to your database. Next is it hides the details of SQL queries from object oriented logic. Okay, so you don't have to write your SQL queries, okay, it is totally hidden. You don't have to worry about your SQL queries. Even if you don't know your queries, JDBC queries, then SQL queries, you can still work using Hibernate. It is based on JDBC. So on the background, your Hibernate is using JDBC, but you don't need to code in JDBC. It is going to convert things into JDBC concept on its own. Okay, so it is working under the basis of, under the hood of JDBC. There is no need to deal with database implementation. So you don't need to have that get string, rs.get integer. You don't have to do all that. Okay, your data will be retrieved irrespective of its data type, irrespective of its field, irrespective of its length, irrespective of its size. Okay, and all the entities based on business concepts rather than database structure. So here you just have to worry about what you are writing in the class, and if you know what you are writing in the class, then it becomes very simple to insert all that you store in a class into the database, and it automatically handles transactions and key generation or primary key generation. Okay, and the development becomes very fast. So due to all these reasons, we prefer Hibernate than JDBC. Okay, let us move on to ORM. As we talked, ORM is a specific tool. Okay, and this tool helps you to map objects, that is your class, to relations, that is your table. So what you are doing is, if you have a simple class called student, in your class student you are having two variables, say ID and name, then you are having a new table. The table is called student, and in that you also have ID and name. So what you are doing is, in your specific class, you are storing your data in variables, and from that variables you are inserting into database. So let us see how actually things are taking place. This is your simple data or your tabular structure where you are having ID and name. Second is your software. Your software is having ID and name. Whatever you are storing in your software ID name, that is in your code, is going to go to the table. So the ID from your student bean class will move into ID from your table, and the name in your software is going to move to name in your database. The names here of the variables and the column fields may be different. In this case I have kept them same, but even if this is, one of them is ID and one of them is identity, still you will be able to map and store them. This thing is done by ORM. There are lots of object relational mapping tools available in the market, but we are using Hibernate as it is very flexible. And all these data, this mapping data, ORM data, is kept in a file called as Hibernate hbm.xml. So this file is called your mapping file. Now let us see what kind of mapping can take place. So the first type of mapping is that of a primitive type. Primitive type is, as you can see, integer. If I want to map, my class file is going to have int or java.lang.integer, which will be stored in a table which has a data type integer, right? Okay, so if long, my class will have this and my database will have big int. Okay, if I have a short mapping kind of thing, Java will have short or java.lang.short, and here I have small int. Similarly for float, I have float and float on both the sides. If I have double, I have double on both sides. If I want big decimal, I can have big decimal or numeric. If I have character, I have string or character 1. If I have string, I have string or varchar. If I have byte, I can byte with tiny int. If I want to convert boolean, then my class file will have boolean and database will have bit. Similarly, I can map dates and time. They can be as java.sql.date by date, java.sql.time by time, timestamp by timestamp, calendar by timestamp and calendar by date. I can also type or typecast or map binary or large objects. I can map my byte array to var binary or blob. I can map my string to clob. I can map any serializable object by blob. I can do clob by clob and blob by blob. These are generally for storing images. So these are the things that you can actually map. Now let us move on to Hibernate architecture. So the architecture of Hibernate is very simple to understand. You have your simple Java application or a place where you are writing your public static void main method. Now in this method you have objects based OR mapping persistence logic. Now what is the meaning of object based OR mapping persistence logic? The meaning is whatever things that you are storing in your Java file is object based. Next is OR, that is object and relational. So whatever you are storing in your database will be mapped onto your table using persistence logic. Now persistence means saving. So whatever data you are writing in your object file or in your Java file, that code or that variable which you are writing in your Java file will be saved into the database using the save logic or persistence logic. Okay, persistence is object saving. Okay, now this thing is done by three different files: hibernate.cfg.xml, hibernate.hbm.xml and Pojo. Okay, now let me explain all these three files to you. Pojo file is a plain old Java object that is nothing but your simple bean file. Bean file is a file in which the variables are private and they have getter setter which are public. So that is my plain old Java object. It is generally a model. Okay, so this is your Java file where you want to store your data. Okay, from where you want to send your data to the database. Next is your hibernate.hbm.xml. So this file you are already familiar. We saw in the previous slide that in this HBM file all your mapping data is kept. So this mapping data is nothing but which variable in your Java class you are storing in which field or which column of your database. So this mapping is kept in the HBM file. Last one is the cfg.xml file. This is the configuration file. So in this configuration file you are storing all the code for your connecting to the database. So that is the URL of your database, the username, the password, which class you are going to load, that is your class.forName method. So all these data for linking to the database you are storing in CFG file. So configuration file has details of the database or to connect with the database. HBM has what thing is mapped to what object is mapped to what relation, and Pojo file is a simple Java file. Okay. Now this there is a second layer called as Hibernate framework, which is going to use all the previous three files that we just saw. Next layer is your layer in which you have your Java database connectivity. As I told you, JDBC works under the hood of Hibernate works under the hood of JDBC. So in the backend it is going to use JDBC. JNDI is Java naming directory interface, and this is used to find out any specific classes or interfaces that you want. And JTS is Java transaction, and this Java transaction is going to take care of your transaction management and commit your data into the database. Okay. and last is your JDBC driver. Without driver you will not be able to connect. Okay, so you can use a specific driver for a specific database, and the last layer is your that of a database. So what happens is, from your Java application you are calling the Hibernate framework, which will call the JDBC API. In the JDBC API we will come to know of which driver you will be using depending on what database you are going to connect, and data can be either stored or data can be retrieved from the database. So the outward flow is from database to the Hibernate framework back to your application. So this is how your overall Hibernate architecture will work. Now this is a simple core theory, but this concept you will be able to understand in a proper way when we code the whole Hibernate program. So in order to understand this architecture in detail, let us move on to the coding. Hello students, welcome to the coding section of Hibernate. Okay, we discussed previously that we are going to create 4 different files in Hibernate for inserting a record into the table. So let us start. I will first on my XAMPP server. Okay, my XAMPP server is being started on port 3306. Meanwhile, let us create a new project. It is Java web application. Next, I will name it Hibernate demo, and let us deploy it on Glassfish. Next, tick on Hibernate framework, and here you can let it be as it is, it's okay. Finish. Okay, so this is my project. First let us have a look on what is there in my project. When we were ticking on 1.4.3, these libraries for Hibernate were added. Okay, so that's why we had that tick on Hibernate. It is deployed on Glassfish. Okay, this is the first thing that I wanted to show you in libraries. Second thing is, we are supposed to create 4 different files, from which I have the hibernate.cfg.xml file already there with me. Let me move on to the source of that file. Now this file looks like this. Okay, it has a Hibernate configuration tag which says that it is going to tell you about what is the driver class, what is the URL to connect with the database, what is the username, what is the password, and dialect. Dialect means with which database you are actually going to connect. So all these details we are supposed to write here. Okay, before we move on to that, let us make it very clear which is the database with which we are going to connect. So we are going to connect with the student database, from which I have a table called stud. So this is where I am going to connect. My stud has name, surname and age. So all these 3 things are there. Here I am going to connect. So in my code here, first thing is I am going to write dialect is MySQL, because I am going to connect with MySQL database. Second thing is the class, driver class. So my class is com.mysql.jdbc.driver. The moment you write this, you have to always import a library or add a library, and that library is JDBC driver, MySQL. Next is, we will write the URL of the database, that is JDBC:/MySQL localhost 3306 and student database. Username is root and password is nothing, so we can self close this. We don't need this thing, right? So this is the first thing that I am doing. Okay, I have done the configuration. Second thing is, now I am going to write a simple Pojo file or my bean file. So file, let me create a Java class, let me name it student bean or Pojo file. I want to map three things here. First is private integer age, next is private string name and private string surname. These are the things that I want to map. I will put the getter setter of this, all the three, and I will create my Pojo file. Okay, next is I have created 2 files out of 4. Now let me create the third file, that is HBM file, that is a mapping file. New, let us move to other, let us move on to Hibernate and mapping wizard. This will create my HBM file. Okay, so next, finish. Okay, this is my mapping file. Inside my mapping file, first I have a tag called class tag. This class tag is going to tell me which is my Pojo file that I am mapping with my student table or database. Okay, so class, I can give name. So the name of my class which I want to map is student B. Okay, you can get this in prompt. And second is table. So with which table I want to connect. In this file I have already given the name of the database. So I don't have to worry about database, I can directly move on to the table that I want to connect. So my table was stud and I can end the class. Now in between this class I am going to do all the other mapping that I want. By other mapping I mean which column is mapped with which other column. Okay, so first is my primary key mapping, that is done by ID. Okay, so I need to create a primary key here. So let us move on to the table first. Table, okay, structure, let us keep say name as the primary key. Okay, so let me select and make it primary. Duplicate entry. Let me try surname and make it primary key. Again duplicate. Let me write age. Okay. Let me create a new table. Let us say new. Let me write age, integer, length is 3. Let me write name, that is varchar, let me write 20, and surname, again varchar, let me write 20. Okay, let me save it. Okay, table name is stud1. Save. Okay, now what we can do is we can make age the primary key, right? Okay, so age is the primary key. Okay, here I need to write stud1. Okay, okay, second is my ID. In this, when I write name is equal to something, here I am going to specify in my student class, that is student bean class, what I want to map. I want to map age. okay, and I want to map it with which column in the table. So the column is also age. Okay. Now there can be two things for your primary key. You can either have auto generation or auto increment, or you can assign the value. So let me keep it assigned. So you have generator, you have class is equal to assigned, means you are inserting data, you are not doing auto increment directly. Second is I want to map two other properties. Okay, so I am mapping, what I have done here in ID is, in my student bean I have age, means here I have this age. Whatever I am storing in this age will move on to column age. So in my database I have a column called age, it will be stored here. I have done this kind of mapping. Okay. Next I am going to write property. So all the other properties I can write in this way. Let me write property name and store it in a column called as name. And let me map the third property. Name, you have surname and you are mapping it with column surname. So this is how my Hibernate mapping file looks like. So we have created a total of 3 files. Now we are going to create a simple public static void main application. So let me create Hibernate calling file. Okay. Now in this, first I need to import two things. Import org.hibernate.cfg.star and import org.hibernate.star. These two things I have imported. Okay. Next is public static void main, which will throws exception. Okay. Now first file that you will call is your configuration file. Without this configuration file you will not be able to move on to the database. Now one thing which I forgot to mention, whenever you create this HBM file, the moment you create this HBM file, there will be a new entry in the CFG file, and that is of this line. Okay, you can see we were only till password when we ended this file, but when you create this Hibernate mapping file, you have a mapping tag, and in the resource attribute it writes hibernate.hbm.xml. So this file path is given here. So you don't have to worry about calling the mapping file, it will directly be called by the CFG file when you are running this file. Okay. So the basic work that you have to do is you have to call your configuration file, and this configuration file will by default call the mapping file. Okay, so we will call this file. When you call this file, your configuration is started. When you are configuring, there will be something called as a session factory. Now you know what is a factory. A factory is a place where things are made. So your session factory is a place where sessions will be made. So if you want to create multiple sessions, you need to create an object or reference of session factory. So this session factory will be called, and after this session factory object you can create new sessions. So let us start with the coding of my Hibernate calling file. First I am going to use a class called as configuration class. CFG is equal to new configuration. Okay. Now this configuration class is going to help me call this particular tag. Okay. So now I have to write cfg.configure, and inside configure I will call the CFG file, that is hibernate.cfg.xml. So I am calling this particular file. So now that I am calling this file, it will come to know what database I am going to connect, the credentials to connect, and it will also come to know what mapping has to be done. Okay, so these things are clear. Now what I need to do is I need to create a session. So in order to create a session, I should have session factory. I should be able to call this particular tag. Which tag? This tag. Okay, so for that I have to write session factory is equal to cfg dot build session factory. Now this cancellation is a deprecated method which is not available in this version, but still you can for the time being use this method. Okay, so now a session factory is built. After you have a session factory built, you can create sessions in that factory. So session is equal to factory dot open session. You can see open session is returning session. So you are storing it in session interface. Both these are interfaces, session and session factory. Okay, now your session is created. Whatever you write in this session will be by default transaction managed. So you need to create an object of transaction management. So transaction T is equal to session dot begin transaction. When you write this statement, whatever data you are going to store in the session or implement in the session will be committed in the database. So for committing, you need to create a reference of the transaction interface. So now you can start writing whatever you want to insert, update or delete. So now I am going to create a simple object of my Pojo file. So I want to create an object of student bean into this particular file. Okay, now they are in the same package, so I can directly create an object of student bean. SB is equal to new student bean. Okay, now using SB I can call the setter methods of age, setter methods of name and setter method of surname. So what I will do is I will set the values. Now I have kept this particular age as assigned, so I have to enter the value of age. I have to set the value of age, right? So SB dot set age, let me set age say 23. SB dot set name, let me write XYZ, and SB dot set surname, let me write as PQMR. Okay, now I have set all these values. Okay, now I want to store it in the database. So for storing I have to use session dot save, and inside this I will pass the student bean object. When I do session dot save, things will be stored inside my database, but it will not be reflected unless and until I do t dot commit or transaction dot commit. After committing, I can close the session and I can print a simple statement, data inserted. Let us run this code. Data inserted. Let me check in the database. Let me browse the table. Yes, 23 XYZ and PQR. Okay. Now if I want to delete the data, then here I am supposed to write session dot delete and SB. Okay, so let me write data deleted. Okay, run. Data deleted. Let us check in the table. Let us browse. Okay, and last we will try for updating. So for that I have to insert first. I have to save the data first. Okay, now I can update with the help of a primary key. So here what I can do is sb.setAge23, here I can write sby and here I can write hello. Okay, and I can do session dot update. So this will update my data with reference to the primary key. Let me run. Okay, let us check in the database sbyn hello. So that's all for Hibernate from my side. Thank you.